Hey everybody, and welcome back to another stream from Northeast Christian Apologetics. Today you are watching the Monday evening book study that we do here on the Northeast Christian Apologetics channel every Monday at 6 p.m. Eastern. We are continuing our reading of The Reason for God by Timothy Keller. So just like in other streams, I'd like to show you Timothy Keller. This is Timothy Keller. He sadly passed away last year, but his sermons are still available on the Gospel in Life YouTube channel as well as their website. They're still doing good stuff in his name. So I really appreciate Timothy Keller's insights and his sermons. I highly recommend you incorporate that into your personal growth as a Christian. Remember that this channel is like this book study, you can kind of consider it to be like a React channel. But instead of reacting to videos and music and things of that nature, we react to books. And I encourage you to follow along in your own book, and you can get this book at christianbooks.com as well as amazon.com. The prices may not be what are shown on the screen, but the rating is stable, and the books, I'm sure, are still there. It's been a long week for me. Really looking forward to diving into reading this book and jumping into tonight's topic, which is chapter 5. We're going to be going into how can a loving God send people to hell? We've been having some movement on the channel too. We've been increasing in subscribers. We're up to, at the time of this stream, we're up to 97. So I'm sure it's just a matter of time before we finally break the goal of 100. I've been doing YouTube videos here for, I think, about 3 years now. It's been a long time coming, so I'm looking forward to it. So if you have not already subscribed, please consider doing so. Help out the channel and help me reach my goal of 100. Don't forget to share the content as well. The purpose of Northeast Christian Apologetics is to help people grow in their Christian walk as well as learn about Christianity. So that's a major feature of the Northeast Christian Apologetics. So chapter 5, going into how can a loving God send people to hell? This is a very tough topic for a lot of people, and it's so difficult that some people recoil at it to the point of actually just rejecting it, even Christians. This idea of hell as a place of eternal conscious torment, you know. And so there's a lot of Christians out there that favor annihilationism, or like there's a limited amount of suffering that a person endures in hell, and then they eventually get promoted up to heaven. You know, it's kind of like a purgatory situation. But yeah, I've met a lot of non-Christians that really recoil at the idea of hell. I remember talking to one in particular because I think that the version of hell which describes hell as being a place of eternal conscious torment, where you are conscious in your suffering, eternal conscious suffering, is the kind of hell that is described in Scripture. It's also the traditional teaching of the church, but it also is useful when it comes to like Pascal's wager, which is something that we're going to be talking about in more depth in the Christian Apologetics series that we're doing here on the Northeast Christian Apologetics channel. This idea of eternal conscious torment or suffering provides so much in the way of consequences, in which it definitely powerfully moves you to a state of in regard to prudence, you know, like taking a pragmatic view of what you should be doing. You know, not all of your decision making is based off of epistemic justifications. We also have to take into consideration pragmatic justifications, especially when epistemic justifications are lacking. So I think that this is really important. We need to talk about hell more deeply, and we need to talk about it compassionately. Like I was saying, that one particular atheist who recoiled at the idea of hell said that if he ever really became convinced that God exists and that hell was a place of eternal conscious suffering, then he would instantly start torturing Christians, as many Christians as he could. And he said this disgusting thing in order to kind of, he said that he would do this in order to demonstrate to God how immoral that kind of thing would be. It'd be like, here, how do you like it? And and there's a lot of problems with that route. Namely, the biggest problem is that that atheist thinks that God has a lack of knowledge somewhere, that he isn't omniscient, that he doesn't have a perfect understanding of the moral landscape. If we are to decide who has a firmer grasp of the moral landscape, should we prefer an atheist who we know is finite and definitely not an omni-being, or a being that is omniscient and does have a strong grasp of how reality is, how the moral landscape is, and things like that? So if we're to prefer one rather than the other, it would definitely be the omniscient being, So, but let's see what Dr. Keller has to say about this. Let's jump over to the reading page. Kaboom. All right, so we're up to chapter 5, like I said. How can a loving God send people to hell? And as with the other chapters, Dr. Keller starts off with some quotes that are pertinent to the discussion. So, I doubt the existence of a judgmental God who requires blood to pacify his wrath, said a frowning Hartmut, a graduate student from Germany. Someone had to die before the Christian God would pardon us. But why can't he just forgive? And then there's also all those places in the Old Testament where God commanded that people be slaughtered. All that is troubling, I agree, responded Josie, who worked for an art gallery in Soho. But I have even more of a problem with the doctrine of hell. The only God that is believable to me is a God of love. The Bible's God is no more than a primitive deity who must be appeased with pain and suffering. In 2005, Rick Warren, megachurch pastor and author of the best-selling book, The Purpose-Driven Life, spoke to leading journalists at a forum sponsored by the Pew Foundation. Some present were troubled by the civil implications of one particular Christian belief, namely that God consigns some people to eternal punishment. One speaker said to Warren, "Maybe you can hold in your mind the contradiction, which is that Wendy, a non-Christian reporter present, is a full American citizen deserving of every protection that the most senior member of your church deserves. But when she dies, she's going to go to hell because she is not saved. The question is, do you think your followers, or the people who come to church, the people who read your books, the people you are talking to all over the world, are sophisticated enough to hold this contradiction in their minds?" Warren responded that his church saw no contradiction between these things, but many of the journalists were unconvinced. They suggested that any Christian who thinks that there are people bound for hell must perceive such people as unequal in dignity and worth. In this, they reflected the deep misgivings of many today about the Christian concept of a God who judges people and sends them to hell. That belief, they contend, leads to exclusion, abuse, division, and even violence. All right, so let's talk about this real quick. The belief that this belief that it will lead to exclusion, abuse, division, and even violence. So it does. The thing about Christianity, as I've discussed in the previous chapters, is that it automatically does lead to division. All right, that's the actual point of Christianity. Remember, Jesus said that a house divided against itself cannot stand. And right now, the earth is under the domain of sin and death. So Jesus is inbreaking and bringing about the kingdom of God is meant to bring division to the kingdom of sin and death. So this kind of division, this violence is meant to overthrow the kingdom of sin and death, which is actually a good thing. All right. And we also talked about in the first chapter how Christianity is an exclusive religion. And that's just the nature of worldviews, and that's just the nature of communities. Communities are inherently exclusive, so even though these charges seem on the surface to be striking or detrimental to the Christian faith, it's actually not. It's either the point or it's actually just a natural consequence of it being a community, you know? All right, so Keller continues, in our culture, divine judgment is one of Christianity's most offensive doctrines. As a minister and preacher, I often find myself speaking on biblical texts that teach the wrath of God, the final judgment, and the doctrine of hell. For many years, I always held a question and answer session immediately after each service. There, I was regularly grilled by New Yorkers about these teachings. I found their deep distress over this aspect of historic Christian faith perfectly understandable, which it is. Although this objection to hell and judgment may seem to be more of a feeling or of revulsion than a doubt, we still can find a number of very specific beliefs hidden inside it. Let's look at each one in turn. A God of judgment simply can't exist. Robert Bella's influential work, Habits of the Heart, speaks of the expressive individualism that dominates American culture. In his book, Bella notes that 80% of Americans agree with the statement, an individual should arrive at his or her own religious beliefs independent of any church or synagogue. He concludes that the most fundamental belief in American culture is that moral truth is relative to individual consciousness. Our culture, therefore, has no problem with a God of love who supports us no matter how we live. It does, however, object strongly to the idea of a God who punishes people for their sincerely held beliefs, even if they are mistaken. This objection, however, has a cultural history to it. In C.S. Lewis's classic The Abolition of Man, he outlines what he considers to be a major difference between the ancient and the modern views of reality. Lewis attacks our smug belief that ancient people believed in magic and later modern science came along and supplanted it. As an expert in medieval age and how it gave way to modernity, Lewis knew that there had been very little magic in the Middle Ages, that the high noon of magic was in the 16th and 17th centuries, at the very time when modern science was developing. The same cause, he contended, gave rise to them both. The serious magical endeavor and the serious scientific endeavor are twins. One was sickly and died, and the other one was strong and throve. But they were twins. They were born of the same impulse. Lewis describes that impulse, a new approach to moral and spiritual reality. There is something which unites magic and applies science while separating both from the wisdom of earlier ages. For the wise men of old, the cardinal problem had been how to conform the soul to reality, and the solution had been knowledge, self-discipline, and virtue. For magic and applied science alike, the problem is how to subdue reality to the wishes of men. The solution is a technique, and both in the practice of this technique are ready to do things hitherto regarded as disgusting and impious. Yeah, that is the thing about magic and also science, you know. It is meant to bend nature to our will, you know. And so a really good book that I recommend checking out that kind of deals with this aspect is The Bible Among the Myths. That book helps to explain what myth is and how the ancient world dealt with gods and things of that nature. You know, why they held sacrifices, which are different than the Jewish sacrifices. Mainly, people in the past have been trying to force nature to bend to our will, and that's what humans tend to want to do. You know, we want to make sure that our environment conforms to us, to make it more suitable for us. But science is more effective in that endeavor. All right, so Keller continues. In ancient times, it was understood that there was a transcendent moral order outside the self built into the fabric of the universe. If you violate that metaphysical order, there were consequences just as severe as if you violated physical reality by placing your hand in a fire. The path of wisdom was to learn to live in conformity with this unyielding reality. That wisdom rested largely in developing qualities of character, such as humility, compassion, courage, discretion, and loyalty. Modernity reversed this. Ultimate reality was seen not so much as a supernatural order, but as the natural order, and that was malleable. Instead of trying to shape our desires to fit reality, we now seek to control and shape reality to fit our desires. The ancients looked at an anxious person and prescribed a spiritual character change. Modernity talks instead of stress management techniques. Lewis knew that readers might think he was against the scientific method as such, but he protested that he was not. He wanted us to realize, however, that the modernity was born in dreams of power. Writing during World War II, Lewis was standing in the midst of some of the bitterest fruit of the modern spirit. Lewis's friend J.R.R. Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings about the consequences of seeking power and control rather than wisdom and glad enjoyment of the givenness of God's creation. The spirit of modernity then gave us the responsibility to determine right or wrong. Our new confidence that we can control the physical environment has spilled over, so we now think we can reshape the metaphysical realm as well. It means that our minds unfair, therefore, it seems to our minds unfair, therefore, that we should determine that it is all right to have sex outside of marriage and later discover that there is a God who is going to punish us for that. We believe so deeply in our personal rights that in this realm that the very idea of a divine judgment day seems impossible. However, as Lewis shows us, this belief is tied to a quest for control and power that has had terrible consequences in recent world history. Not all the human race today has accepted modernity's view of things. Why should we act as if it is inescapable? And I'm bringing this to light as well in Christian Apologetics, the book series that's coming out every Tuesday on the weekdays. I mean, during the weekdays. But in that book right now, I'm reading about truth. And in that book, we learn that we need to make sure that we conform our beliefs to reality. That's how we have truth. That is what truth is. But there are certain metaphysical models of truth that just says that as long as you're internally coherent, then it's fine. There doesn't need to be any correlation to reality or correspondence to reality. But in that book, we argue for the correspondence theory of truth, which is the most prevalent view of truth. And this is the kind of truth that's kind of assumed in The Reason for God by Timothy Keller here, the correspondence view of truth. So we need to make sure that our beliefs are corresponding to reality. And if they don't, then reality has a way of confronting us on that. Reality is unyielding. So if you fail to conform your beliefs to reality, then that can result in a decline of mental health. But I go into more detail on that when we're talking about Christian apologetics. But anyway, by Douglas Groheis, and that will be coming on in the following weeks. But let's see what Keller has to say. So Keller continues. In one of my after-service discussions, a woman told me that the very idea of a judging God was offensive. I said, "Why aren't you offended by the idea of a forgiving God?" She looked puzzled. I continued, "I respectfully urge you to consider your cultural location when you find the Christian teaching about hell offensive." I went on to point out that the secular Westerners get upset by the Christian doctrine of hell, but they find biblical teaching about turning and the other cheek and forgiving enemies appealing. I then asked her to consider how someone from a very different culture sees Christianity. In traditional societies, the teaching about turning the other cheek makes absolutely no sense. It offends people's deepest instincts about what is right. For them, the doctrine of a God of judgment, however, is no problem at all. That society is repulsed by aspects of Christianity Western people enjoy, and are attacked by the aspect of secular Westerners can't stand. In the last chapter, Dr. Keller talks about a society or a culture that prefers honor. So in these kinds of cultures, honor is the most important thing. So you make moral judgments based off of how people are going to react to you and how much honor you will receive by doing that kind of stuff. So all of that is heavily influenced by judgment and making sure that you are receiving honor. All right. But American culture isn't so concerned about honor in that way. All right, so Keller continues, why, I concluded, should Western cultural sensitivities or sensibilities be the final court in which to judge whether Christianity is valid? I asked the woman gently whether she thought her culture superior to non-Western ones. She immediately answered no. Well then, I asked, why should your culture's objections to Christianity trump theirs? For the sake of argument, let's imagine that Christianity is not the product of any one culture, but is actually the transcultural truth of God. If that were the case, we would expect that it would contradict and offend every human culture at some point, because human cultures are ever-changing and imperfect. If Christianity were the truth, It would have to be offending and correcting your thinking at some place. Maybe this is the place, the Christian doctrine of divine judgment. So a God of judgment can't be a God of love. In Christianity, God is both a God of love and of justice. Many people struggle with this. They believe that a loving God, can't be a judging God. Like most other Christian ministers in our society, I have been asked literally thousands of times, how can a God of love be also a God of filled with wrath and anger? If he is loving and perfect, he should forgive and accept everyone. He shouldn't get angry. I always start my response by pointing out that all loving persons are sometimes filled with wrath, not just despite of, but because of their love. If you love a person and you see someone ruining them, even they themselves, you get angry. As Becky Rippert put in her book, Hope Has Its Reasons, think how we feel when we see someone we love ravaged by unwise actions or relationships. Do we respond with a benign tolerance as we might toward strangers? Far from it. Anger isn't the opposite of love. Hate is. And the final form of hate is indifference. God's wrath is not a cranky explosion, but his settled opposition to the cancer, which is eating out the insides of the human race he loves with his whole being. This is super important. So I'm going to highlight this. And if you have a book and are following along, I recommend you do the same. The opposite of love is not really anger. It's not anger. It's actually ultimately indifference. It's a lack of love. You know, that's what indifference is. It's just failing to love. And that's what sin is. You know, so when we fail to love someone properly, when we fail to love God properly and other people, that is sin, you know, and so indifference, you know, like this idea that is rampant in our culture about like live and let live. I don't really care what you do you. That's hate. You're not loving somebody. You're actually just hating them. All right. And so that's something that we need to discourage. You know, we shouldn't just be like, oh, you live your own life and I'm not going to bother you. You know, it's like we need to love these people properly. That's not properly ordered love when we fail to love them, when we just let them do whatever they want, even if it's self-destructive. You know? All right, so Keller continues, the Bible says that God's wrath flows from his love and delight in his creation. He is angry at evil and injustice because it is destroying its peace and integrity. The Lord is righteous in all his ways and loving towards all he has made. The Lord watches over those who love him, but all the wicked he will destroy. It is at this point that many people complain that those who believe in a God of judgment will not approach enemies with a desire to reconcile with them. If you believe in a God who smites evildoers, you may think it perfectly justified to do some of the smiting yourself. Yale theologian Miroslav Volf, a Croatian who has seen the violence in the Balkans, does not see the doctrine of God's judgment that way. He writes, if God were not angry at injustice and deception and did not make a final end to violence, that God would not be worthy of worship. The only means of prohibiting all recourse to violence by ourselves is to insist that violence is legitimate only when it comes from God. My thesis that the practice of nonviolence requires a belief in divine vengeance will be unpopular with many in the West. But it takes the quiet of a suburban home for the birth of this thesis that human nonviolence results from the belief in God's refusal to judge. In a sun-scorched land soaked in the blood of the innocent, it will invariably die with other pleasant captivities of the liberal mind. This is another one that I'm personally going to highlight. I'm going to start from here. You know, we live in a soft age, you know, where I'm going to also say this, why not? I'm going to react.
Well said.
Well said. All right, so it takes a gentle life, a soft life, to not see the need for justice of this matter. Okay, when you see evil being perpetrated to the extent that some people have experienced evil, it needs to call out for justice in certain kinds of ways. And what Wolf is talking about here is that God is the only one who is properly placed in order to deal out justice in any kind of violent way. Even through commands and stuff. We, as Christians, should not be seeking vengeance. We should not be seeking violence on anyone. We should be seeking to love and to leave the vengeance for God. We need to just endure the suffering and bless those that persecute us, just as the Lord says, and trust that God has it under control, And so actually the biblical God does Christianity prevents Christians, when you understand the doctrine properly, prevents Christians from doing the smiting ourselves, because we just trust God that his judgment will take effect in whatever way it seems appropriate to God. And that's the thing. All right, so Keller continues. In this fascinating passage, Wolf reasons that it is the lack of belief in a God of vengeance that secretly nourishes violence. The human impulse to make perpetrators of violence pay for their crimes is almost an overwhelming one. It cannot possibly, be overcome with platitudes like, now don't you see that violence doesn't solve anything? If you have seen your home burned down and your relatives killed and raped, such talk is laughable, and it shows no real concern for justice. Yet victims of violence are drawn to go far beyond justice into vengeance that says, you put out one of my eyes, so I'll put out both of yours. They are pulled inexorably into an endless cycle of vengeance, of strikes and counterstrikes, nurtured and justified by the memory of terrible wrongs. Can our passion for justice be honored in a way that does not nurture our desire for blood vengeance? Wolf says the best resource for this is belief in the concept of God's divine justice. If I don't believe that there is a God who will eventually put all things right, I will take up the sword and will be sucked into the endless vortex of retaliation. All right, I'm going to highlight this personally, and if you would like to as well, I encourage it. But this is something that you see all the time in movies nowadays, like John Wick, or a lot of action movies is a one-man army going out and taking vengeance on people that have wronged him. That's not the Christian way. The Christian way is to pray for those who persecute you, to trust that God has it under control, that he has not turned a blind eye to it. Even if we can't see God working in the background, we need to trust that God has it under control. When we see our enemy hungry, we feed him. Thirsty, we give them something to drink. God has it under control. We suffer for righteousness' sake. Okay, so Keller continues, only if I am sure that there is a God who will right all wrongs and settle all accounts perfectly do I have the power to refrain. All right. Oh my goodness. These names, I don't even know what this, how do you say it? Czesław. All right, so Czesław Miłosz, the Nobel Prize-winning Polish poet, wrote the remarkable essay, The Discreet Charms of Nihilism. In it, he remembers how Marx had called religion the opiate of the people because the promise of an afterlife, Marx said, led the poor and the working class to put up with unjust social conditions. But Miłosz continued, and now we are witnessing a transformation. A true opium of the people is a belief in nothingness after death, the huge solace of thinking that our betrayals, greed, cowardice, murders are not going to be judged. But all religions recognize that our deeds are imperishable. Many people complain that belief in a God of judgment will lead to a more brutal society. Miłosz, let me verify this. Let's see if it comes up. Miłosz. Milosz had personally seen in both Nazism and communism that a loss of belief in a God of judgment can lead to brutality. If we are free to shape life and morals any way we choose without ultimate accountability, it can lead to violence. Wolff and Milosz argue that the doctrine of God's final judgment is a necessary undergirding for human practices of love and peacemaking. And this is a part of the moral argument for God's existence and the moral framework of Christianity. That not only is objective morality of a true feature of reality, but it is coupled with the accountability that God provides. This is why Christianity provides a more robust moral framework than like atheistic moral frameworks, because God exists and he can hold people accountable and apply final justice where others are lacking. Okay. All right. So Keller continues. A loving God would not allow hell. You may say, fighting evil and injustice in a world is one thing, but sending people to hell is another. The Bible speaks of eternal punishment. How does that fit in with the love of God? I cannot reconcile even the idea of hell with a loving God. How do we address this understandable recoiling? All right, just a second. I see a comment. Yahuwah says not one sin will go unpunished. He will take care of it. Thank you. Praise be your name in the highest. Abba Yahuwah and your son, King Master Yahushua. All right. Well said. Yep. There is definitely going to be punishment, and that's going to be a good thing. A good thing. All right, so Keller continues. Modern people inevitably think that hell works like this. God gives us time, but if we haven't made the right choices by the end of our lives, he casts our soul into hell for all eternity. As the poor souls fall through space, they cry out for mercy, but God says, "Too late! You had your chance, now you will suffer." This caricature misunderstands the very nature of evil. The biblical picture is that sin separates us from the presence of God, which is the source of all joy and indeed of all love, wisdom, and good things of any sort. Since we were originally created for God's immediate presence, only before his face will we thrive, flourish, and achieve our highest potential. If we were to lose his presence totally, that would be hell, the loss of our capability for giving or receiving love or joy. A common image of hell in the Bible is that of fire. Fire disintegrates. Even in this life, we can see the kind of soul disintegration that self-centeredness creates. We know how selfishness and self-absorption leads to piercing bitterness, nauseating envy, paralyzing anxiety, paranoid thoughts, and the mental denials and distortions that accompany them. Now ask the question, what if when we die we don't end, but spiritually our life extends on into eternity? Hell then is the trajectory of a soul living in self-absorption, self-centered life, going on and on forever. Jesus' parable of Lazarus and the rich man in Luke 16 supports the view of hell we are presenting here. Lazarus is a poor man who begs at the gate of the cruel rich man. They both die, and Lazarus goes to heaven while the rich man goes to hell. There he looks up and sees Lazarus in heaven, in Abraham's bosom. So he called to him, "Father Abraham, have pity on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I am in agony in this fire." But Abraham replied, "Son, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things, while Lazarus received bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. And besides all this, between us and you is a great chasm. A great chasm has been fixed, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to us." He answered, "Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them, so that they will not also come to this place of torment." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them." "No, Father Abraham," he said, "but if someone But if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent. He said to him, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. What is astonishing is that though their statuses have now been reversed, their statuses have now been reversed, the rich man seems to be blind to what has happened. He still expects Lazarus to be his servant and treats him as his water boy. He does not ask to get out of hell, yet strongly implies that God never gave him and his family enough information about the afterlife. Commentators have noted the astonishing amount of denial, blame shifting, and spiritual blindness in this soul in hell. They have also noted that the rich man, unlike Lazarus, is never given a personal name. He is only called a rich man, strongly hinting that since he had built his identity on his wealth rather than on God, once he lost his wealth, he lost any sense of self. In short, hell is simply one's freely chosen identity apart from God on a trajectory into infinity. We see this process writ small in addictions to drugs, alcohol, gambling, and pornography. First, there is disintegration because as time goes on, you need more and more of the addictive substance to get an equal kick, which leads to less and less satisfaction. Second, there is the isolation, as increasingly you blame others and circumstances in order to justify your behavior. No one understands, everyone is against me, is muttered in greater and greater self-pity and self-absorption. When we build our lives on anything but God, that thing, though a good thing, becomes an enslaving addiction, something we have to be happy. Personal disintegration happens on a broader scale. In eternity, this disintegration goes on forever. There is increasing isolation, denial, delusion, and self-absorption. When you lose all humility, you are out of touch with reality. No one ever asks to leave hell. The very idea of heaven seems to them a sham. And so, this is the importance of making sure that you love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Okay? That is that if the golden rule is to love others as you love yourself, then to love God with everything that you have is like the platinum rule. Anything that's greater than gold. That's much more important than anything else. This is what saves you from this kind of disintegration, is loving God more than you love yourself or your family or your addiction or your hobby or your job or your bank account or your house, or all those things combined. This is the importance that we have here. We need to love in the way that Jesus loved. What would Jesus do should be on every disciple's mind as they go throughout the day. All right, so Keller continues. In his fantasy, The Great Divorce, which is great, I recommend reading it, C.S. Lewis describes a busload of people from hell who come to the outskirts of heaven. There, they are urged to leave behind the sins that have trapped them in hell, but they refuse. Lewis's descriptions of these people are striking because we recognize in them the self-delusion and self-absorption that are writ small in our own addictions. Hell begins with a grumbling mood, always complaining, always blaming others, but you are still distinct from it. You may even criticize it in yourself and wish you could stop it, but there may come a day when you can no longer. Then there will be no you left to criticize the mood or even to enjoy it, but just the grumble itself, going on forever like a machine. It is not a question of God sending us to hell. In each of us there is something growing, which will be hell unless it is nipped in the bud. The people in hell are miserable, but Lewis shows us why. We see raging like unchecked flames, their pride, their paranoia, their self-pity, their certainty that everyone else is wrong, that everyone else is an idiot. All their humility is gone, and thus so is their sanity. They are utterly, finally locked in the prison of their own self-centeredness, and their pride progressively expands into a bigger and bigger mushroom cloud. They continue to go to pieces forever, blaming everyone but themselves. Hell is that, writ large. That is why it is a travesty to picture God casting people into a pit who are crying, "I'm sorry, let me out." The people on the bus from hell in Lewis's parable would rather have their freedom, as they defined it, than salvation. Their delusion is that. If they glorified God, they would somehow lose power and freedom. But in a supreme and tragic irony, their choice has ruined their own potential for greatness. Hell is, as Lewis says, the greatest monument to human freedom. As Romans 1:24 says, God gave them up to their desires. All God does in the end with people is give them what they most want, including freedom from himself. What could be more fair than that? Lewis writes, there are only two kinds of people, those who say, thy will be done, to God, or those to whom God says in the end, thy will be done. All that are in hell choose it. Without that self-choice, it wouldn't be hell. No soul that seriously and constantly desires joy will ever miss it. Hell and the equality of people. Let's return to the doubtful journalists at the Pew Forum with Rick Warren. They were concerned that any Christian who believes that some people are bound for hell must necessarily perceive such people as being unequal, less deserving of civil rights. This concern misunderstands what the Bible teaches about the nature of salvation and damnation. As C.S. Lewis points out, the journey to hell is a process which can begin with something as apparently innocuous as a grumbling mood. No one can look out at a congregation on a Sunday morning, a crowd at Yankee Stadium, or the audience of the Metropolitan Opera and be sure of who is ultimately going to arrive in heaven or hell. Today's outspoken believer may be tomorrow's apostate, and today's outspoken unbeliever may be tomorrow's convert. We must not make settled, final decisions about anyone's spiritual state or fate. After speaking about the Christian faith to a gathering in a Manhattan townhouse, I was approached by two women who had heard my presentation. They both told me that believing in eternal judgment made me a very narrow person. I asked them, you think I'm wrong about these religious questions? And I think you are wrong. Why doesn't that make you as narrow as me? One woman retorted, that's different. You think we are eternally lost. We don't think you are. That makes you more narrow than us. I didn't agree, and here is what I proposed to them. Both the Christian and the secular person believe that self-centeredness and cruelty have very harmful consequences. Because Christians believe souls don't die, they also believe that moral and spiritual errors affect the soul forever. Liberal secular persons also believe that there are terrible moral and spiritual errors, like exploitation and oppression. But since they don't believe in an afterlife, they don't think the consequences of wrongdoing go on into eternity. Because Christians think wrongdoing has infinitely more long-term consequences than secular people do, does that mean they are somehow narrower? Imagine two people arguing over the nature of a cookie. Jack thinks the cookie is a poison and Jill thinks it is not. Jack thinks Jill's mistaken view of the cookie will send her to the hospital or worse. Jill thinks Jack's mistaken view of the cookie will keep him from having a fine dessert. Is Jack more narrow-minded than Jill just because he thinks the consequences of her mistake are more dire? I don't believe anyone would think so. Christians, therefore, aren't more narrow because they think wrong things and behaviors have eternal effects. All right, yeah, this is very common. You know, it doesn't, belief in hell, belief in Christianity, as we've discussed already, even in this book, do not make you a more narrow person. All right. Christianity is, and this is going to be coming out as well in the character of Jesus. The next chapter is chapter 10. It's coming out on Thursday. And in that chapter, Charles Jefferson talks about the broadness of Jesus. The Christian worldview is an incredibly broad worldview. It's able to incorporate an enormous amount of perspectives and cultures and races and diversity, as evidenced by the global landscape. When you look at how Christianity is spread out over the globe, it is a very culturally diverse religion, and it's also striking how evenly distributed Christianity is across the major cultures, the major regions of the globe. It's by far the most culturally diverse religion on the planet. You know, so like you're actually less narrow-minded as a Christian, even when you do have specific beliefs. And it's really interesting with regard to that. And just because you have become convinced in a particular truth doesn't make you more narrow-minded. You know, you can still have an open mind, but still believe in a particular truth and become convinced of a particular truth. And that doesn't make you narrow-minded. All right. Just like if you're saying, well, the address of a particular friend is so-and-so, if you know the address of a particular person, you know that to be true, it doesn't make you narrow-minded. It just means that you know where they live, So like having true beliefs doesn't make you narrow-minded in and of itself. All right. So keep that in mind. All right, so I believe in a God of love. During my college years and my early 20s, I, like so many others, questioned the Christian faith I was raised in. There were subjective reasons for my doubts. Christianity just didn't seem real to me experientially. I had not developed a prayer life and had never experienced God personally. There were also intellectual problems I was having with Christianity, all of which I am addressing elsewhere in this book. There was one, however, I will talk about here. I was troubled by those Christians who stressed hellfire and damnation. Like so many of my generation, I believed that if there was a core to all religions, it was a loving God. I wanted to believe in a God of love who accepted people regardless of their beliefs and practices. I began to take courses in other major religions of the world: Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Confucianism, and Judaism. I have profited to this day from those studies. However, my explorations in other faiths proved me wrong on this particular point about the centrality of a loving God. I found no other religious texts outside of the Bible that said God created the world out of love and delight. Most ancient pagan religions believed the world was created through struggles and violent battles between opposing gods and supernatural forces. I turned to look more closely at Buddhism, the religion I liked best at the time. However, despite its great emphasis on selflessness and detached service to others, Buddhism did not believe in a personal God at all, and love is the action of a person. Later on, after I became a minister, I was a speaker and panelist for several years in a monthly discussion program in Philadelphia between a Christian church and a mosque. Each month, a speaker from the church and a speaker from the mosque would give a biblical and Quranic perspective on a topic. When we covered the topic of God's love, it was striking how different our conceptions were. I was told repeatedly by Muslim speakers that God was indeed loving in the sense of being merciful and kind to us. But when Christians spoke of the Lord as our spouse, of knowing God intimately and personally, and of having powerful effusions of his love poured into our hearts by the Holy Spirit, our Muslim friends balked. They told us that it was disrespectful in their view to speak of anyone knowing God personally. Today, many of the skeptics I talk to say, as I once did, they can't believe in the God of the Bible who punishes and judges people because they believe in a God of love. I now ask, what makes them think God is love? Can they look at life in the world today and say, this proves that the God of the world is the God of love? Can they look at history and say, this all shows that the God of history is a God of love? Can they look at the religious texts of the world and conclude that God is a God of love? By no means is that the dominant ruling attribute of God as understood in any of the major faiths. I must conclude that the source of the idea that God is love is the Bible itself, and the Bible tells us that the God of love is also a God of judgment who will put all things in the world to rights in the end. The belief in a God of pure love who accepts everyone and judges no one is a powerful act of faith. Not only is there no evidence for it in the natural order, but there is almost no historical religious textual support for it outside of Christianity. The more one looks at it, the less justified it appears. All right. And so with that, we've reached the end of the chapter. All right. So, and you know what that means? That means that we get to celebrate. Woohoo! Congratulations! We got to the end of the chapter. Chapter 5 is all done. Wow. I'm not going to lie. I kind of feel like that was kind of an abrupt end. I wasn't expecting it to end right there. He's going to move on to chapter 6, Science's Disprove Christianity. But yeah. All right. Well, yep. And don't forget to subscribe. Yeah, I'm kind of surprised it ended so quickly like that. I feel like there could be a lot more said on this topic. Hell is a very deep topic. I think that Dr. Keller talked about a lot of good things here as well. But there is definitely a lot more that can be said. And when we talk about God being a God of judgment, it is definitely good to meditate on and remember that this kind of view of God equips us to better handle the sufferings that we endure, especially from other people, knowing that God has our back, and relying on God to handle the situation for us, like we don't need to, if we get cut off on the road, we don't need to get in front of them and stop them and try to confront them with violence or anything like that. We don't need to do that. We can just count on God that God has it under control and just move on with our lives. Pray for that person instead and act in love. Hell is a very difficult topic, and losing salvation or not attaining salvation is a terrible price to pay, and that should give us pause. That should be something that we consider, take into consideration when we're doing worldview analysis. What kind of worldviews are there that threaten eternal conscious suffering, and which ones ought to be preferred? And I actually have a video that talks about that, which is called The Problem of Death's Door, which I've mentioned a couple of times in other videos. Highly recommend checking that out. Very helpful kind of stuff. But thanks for coming out to the book study this Monday evening. I really appreciate you. And next week we'll talk about how science has disproved Christianity. I released that claim. All right. Anyway, have a great night. God bless.
Hey, before you go, I hope you enjoyed today's enlightening discussion during our Christian Apologetics book study. It's always a blessing to come together to explore our faith and grow in our understanding. Your participation means the world to me, and I'm grateful for your continued support of Northeast Christian Apologetics. Remember, you can stay connected with me and access valuable resources by visiting my website at nechristianapologetics.com. There you'll find a wealth of articles, videos, and recommended reading material to deepen your knowledge of Christian apologetics. If you're as passionate as I am about equipping believers to defend their faith and engage in meaningful conversations, you can also support this ministry in various ways. One way to support this work is through patreon.com. By becoming a patron, you'll have access to exclusive content, early access to our discussions, and a chance to connect with like-minded individuals who share your passion for Christian apologetics. If Patreon is not your style, some people prefer to give me a one-time tip. And if you'd like to do that, then feel free to do so through Venmo or Cash App. But of course, there are many ways to support me. By praying for this ministry, sharing the content on social media, or simply spreading the word about what I do. Every bit of support goes a long way in helping me fulfill my mission. Once again, thank you for joining me today. Your presence and engagement enrich these discussions, and together, we're on a journey to strengthen our faith and share the good news with others. Stay tuned for more exciting book studies, thought-provoking discussions, and opportunities to grow your Christian apologetics journey. I look forward to seeing you again.